I'm sure we all have our ways of remembering things. For me, the way I do this, and I know this is kind of goofy, but this is just the way I've kind of gotten to do it, is beginning of each week, I sit down and I look at my calendar and I take on these pieces of paper. These are old scrap pieces of paper. I put a circle and I write down the things I need to remember to do. Now, what's interesting is sometimes those things are weekly things that there's no way I'm going to forget to do it, but I put it down on that list anyway. And the reason is kind of twofold. One is I want to make sure that I am able to kind of provide enough time for all the things I start putting down on that list. The other thing is there's great satisfaction of checking things off a list. Sometimes, even after I've done things, I'll put it down and then I'll check it off just so that I have all those things checked off. I don't think I'm the only one that's done that, right? Anyway, this is how I remember to do things. And as we age, sometimes that becomes even more important because let's face it, we all have a problem from time to time with remembering. I mean, forgetting is something that we all do. Now, as I often do in these devotionals and sometimes in my sermons, I look up really obvious words in the dictionary to see what the definition is. And so I looked that up, and this is what I found. The definition of forget is this: fail to remember. No surprises there, right? Fail to remember. Of course it is. Interesting, though, I looked at the two alternates that I had underneath there, and there was a really interesting distinction. One of them said, inadvertently neglecting to do, bring, or mention something. I'm going to read that again. Inadvertently neglect to do, bring, or mention something. That's forgetting, right? The other one is this: put out of one's mind, cease to think or consider something. Do you hear the difference in those two things? There's a very important difference. One mentions things that happen inadvertently. We just forget. The other thing is intentionality. I'm intentionally putting something out of my mind so that I forget it. That is a real key difference when it comes to understanding this command we have to remember, because that is a command in Scripture. We are often told to remember things. Now, I was reading a devotional that kind of related to this, and the author of the devotional suggested that sometimes we forget the things that God has said to us. Sometimes we forget the things that God has done for us and for the world that we're in. Sometimes we forget what God has called us to do. Sometimes we forget what God has called us to be. The question is it inadvertent or is it intentional? Now, maybe you're thinking to yourself, oh, I would never intentionally forget something. But you know what? I think sometimes we do. I think sometimes those things that God has called us to do, we simply put out of our mind so they don't keep bothering us. You know what I mean? The things that you know you're commanded to do, or the things that you are invited to do by your God, but for some reason, you just don't want to think about it. You just don't want to do it. In fact, I was reminded of a quote that a TV personality said a couple years ago, and it's really kind of stuck with me. He said this. He said, if we are going to be a Christian nation that doesn't help the poor, either we have to pretend that Jesus was just as selfish as we are, or we've got to admit that he commanded us to love the poor and serve the needy without condition, and then just admit that we don't want to. Now, whether or not you like that quote, I think there's a really important message in mind. If we are reading the Scripture, if we are attending to the Scripture, and we come upon something that we really don't want to do, I mean, sometimes pretending that we forgot is the only way to get through that. I mean, remember Jesus told us to love our enemies, right? Yeah, okay. How do we do that? Sometimes it's easy just to forget, but which kind of forget? It was so important that God has a people that remember. that one of the most important commands of all of Scripture, one of the most important things that God put on the lips of Moses to communicate to the people was this. It's known as the Shema, and I know I've used this passage before. Deuteronomy 6:4. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord alone. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might. Keep these words that I am commanding to you today in your heart. Recite them to your children. Talk about them when you are at home and when you are away, when you lie down and when you rise up. Bind them as signs on your hand. Fix them as emblems on your forehead. Write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. In other words, remember to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, strength, and mind. And then Jesus said this, remember to love your neighbor as yourself. You know, it's not easy to do, but it's the command that God gives us. It's the command that God gives us to remember God in all of things. And remember, I think as well, neighbor and the caring for that neighbor as we care for ourselves.